And now you'll notice that I have both pressure and rate in my production editor now. And again, I don't need to append any data to the data set, so I'm going to leave that on no and hit next. And at this point, I don't have any additional information I need to import, so I'm going to select no on this wizard now. And now I'm going to take you into the data management tab. So I'm going to leave this on yes, and we're going to be taken over to our data management tab. And I'm just going to move this wizard out of the way for a few minutes here as we work. So you can see down here we have basically a list of all the gauge data we've brought into the software. So the purpose of the data management tab is to allow us to see all the raw data that we've brought into the software. Please be aware that the data that you see in the production editor is actually a separate copy from the data you see in data management. So ultimately what we're going to do here is we're going to keep all our raw data intact just the way it is, and we're going to use a copy of that in the production editor. So automatically the production editor, because we've only brought in one pressure gauge and one rate gauge, that has all been populated for us automatically. So we really don't have to do too much in here at this point. So going back to data management, what I'm going to do in here is basically this can be used to do gauge comparisons if you have more than one pressure gauge and they were run synchronously in time. So you may want to just compare those two pressure gauges to see if there's any anomalies between the gauges or if there's a gauge malfunction or things like that. In this case, these pressures are measured at surface, so we don't really need to build a gauge comparison plot. However, what we might want to do is we might want to build just a basic raw data plot that we can use to submit in a report or something like that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with our pressure gauge here, which is denoted as gauge 1, and I'm going to maximize this plot. So and all of these plotting functions I'm going to cover in this demo are pretty much standard throughout the software. So when I maximize a plot like this toolbar button you'll see on pretty much every plot in the system. And so if you ever need to maximize a plot, that's the way to do it. Okay, so we've expanded this view, and what I want to do is I'm actually going to make a copy of this plot. I'm going to leave this original plot alone. So I'm going to go over here to the toolbar and I'm going to select copy to new plot, and that's just going to create an exact copy of this gauge 1 plot. Okay, so this is the plot I'm going to modify. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to rename this plot and the tab as well. So I'm going to select rename plot here, and I'm going to call this our pressure temperature plot. Pressure temperature plot. And basically, actually, sorry, I'm going to change that. I didn't bring in temperatures, so I'm going to just call it our pressure plot. There we go. And essentially what I'm going to do is I'm just going to do some basic customizations to this plot. This is really just for reporting purposes. So one of the things I'm going to do is the bottom scale right now is in a date clock format, and I want to actually show that in more of a cum time format. So what I'm going to do is just right click anywhere over the plot, and the first option right in the menu there says plot versus total cum time. I'm going to select that, and you'll see that the bottom axis here changes to time, and over here on the left I have my casing pressure. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to customize that axis. So again, I'm going to right click over the axis, hit customize axis, and I'm going to use some nice round numbers here. So maybe I'll put 800 in for our lower limit and 6,000 for the upper limit, and I'll leave the number of steps at 5. That's a good number of steps for now. And same thing on the time axis. Again, I'll right click there, hit customize axis, and I'm going to make this 75, 10 steps. Okay, so we get some nice square grid lines going in the plot, so it looks a little nicer for reporting. Legends can be moved anywhere in the plot, so maybe I'll put my legend down here so it's a little more out of the way. So there's my basic pressure plot. And again, you can do this to any of the gauge plots you've got. If you want to make a specific one for the rate gauge, you can do that. It's basically the same procedure. Okay, so that's kind of some of the basics on the plot creation. I'm just going to quickly go through some of the other features here. You'll notice that as I click anywhere on this plot, that there's a marker there that moves along with me. And you'll notice in the upper right hand corner here I've got a zoom plot, and basically that just shows me a zoom of this portion of the data that I'm on right now on the main plot down below. So I can easily see very specific points that I'm interested in on that zoom plot if I need to hone in on something. You'll notice in the upper left I've got a grid here which highlights the row that I'm on. So these markers are always in sync with that row. So as I step through my data set, you'll notice it'll take me to that row in the grid. So if I need to check something in the data set, maybe I see some noise or something in the data, I can go to that exact row on the grid and try and determine if that data is of good quality or if I need to remove it or make changes or something like that. You can make some basic changes to the raw data itself if you need to do that. For example, if I need to change this pressure for whatever reason, I can do that. We've got full undo and redo capability just like in a lot of other standard software, so I can undo that change. So that's kind of the basics of the plotting grid system here under data management. I will touch on the synchronize tab here quickly. Essentially, when I synchronize my data sets, what I'm trying to do is I have a primary data set and a secondary data set, and I'm trying to adjust the date and clock time on the secondary data set so that basically my rates are going to line up correctly with my pressure response. So you notice down up here we've got my pressure data set, that's the primary. I've got the rate data set down here, which is secondary. So all I need to do is I have a couple sync arrows here, and basically I just need to indicate what point needs to be synchronized between these two data sets. So typically what we do is we identify the final flowing pressure point. And again, we have a zoom plot over on the right here. So as I move my marker, I can zoom in and I can find my final flowing pressure point, which is going to be right there. Okay. And then on the rate gauge here, I just need to find that last final flowing rate, which is going to be right there. Okay. And then down here we'll see the result of that synchronized process. So you'll notice these were already more or less lined up to begin with, so you really don't see a big difference from the original raw imported data. However, I just wanted to demonstrate how to actually perform a synchronization if that is necessary. So you may run into cases where you'll see differences of maybe upwards of a day between the rate and pressure response. So those things would need to be corrected using this synchronization module. So if we just expand that result plot, we can just get a better look and just see, we can see that the shut-in point is lining up with our build-up pressures here now, and that's what we want. Okay, once we've done a synchronize, we just simply hit the apply button, and that will modify the date and clock times on this rate gauge accordingly so that it maintains that synchronization that we established here. The final tab under data management, data merge, actually allows us to combine various gauges together into an actual merged gauge. This really works best when you have multiple, say, production data sets, or you have multiple pressure gauge data sets. Maybe you've run a couple tests that were separated by a few months and you want to just mesh all that data together. So in this example here, just to demonstrate the functionality, I'm going to merge the pressure and rate gauges together into just one gauge. So in this case, the merge is very simple to use. Basically, you just pick the gauges you want to merge, and it lists all the data sets within those gauges on the left-hand side here. You can tell it which ones you'd like to merge. So for example, I can say don't merge the rate gauge, and you'll notice it removes it from the plot. And then over here you'll notice that there's a primary column here, and that's really only necessary when we have gauges with the exact same data types within them. So for example, if we had two gauges with two sets of gas rates, we would have to pick one of those as the primary in case there's any overlap. So if there's two data points between those two gauges that fall on the exact same date and clock time, we need to tell the merge which one of those is going to be preserved and which one is going to be removed. Most of the time though that won't be the case. More often than not you're going to be merging data that doesn't overlap. So like I said, you'll have one test that's run a few months prior to another test, and basically you're just more or less doing an append between the two sets of gauges. So that's where this would be used. Once I've selected all the gauges and data sets I want to merge here, if I hit apply, what it'll do is it'll actually create another gauge here, and it'll just label the gauges sequentially, merged 1, merged 2, and so on, depending on how many merges I perform. But basically this merged data set now has both pressure and rate in it, whereas our original raw data gauges like gauge 1 only had the casing pressures, gauge 2 only had the rates. So this is just a combination of both. So again, that's just to demonstrate some of the basic functionality of data management. So from here I'm going to continue on with the wizard, and I'm going to go back to the production editor first. Now whenever we make changes in data management, it's going to ask us to reselect our raw data gauges we want to use in the production editor. So again, it's just making a copy of the raw data gauges. It's making a separate copy of those in the production editor so we can further refine that information and then do our analysis. So in this case we're going to stick with our original gauge 1 casing pressure, gauge 2 gas rate. I'm just going to click OK, and then it's just going to warn me I'm overwriting what was in the production editor, which is fine because we're just overwriting the same information that was in there. Okay, so I'm going to bring the wizard back here. So we finished our data management step.